Let's bring in Wyoming Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney, Vice Chair of the January 6th Committee. Congresswoman, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me, Bret. Good to be with you.
What did you make of the Vice President and the President's speeches today in Statuary Hall?
Well, I thought that there were a number of things that they said that I agreed with. I think when you look at what happened and at the attack that happened on January 6th, I think it's different from what happened on 9/11, different from Pearl Harbor. Obviously, 3,000 Americans died in each of those events, each of those attacks. But this was a mob that was summoned by and provoked by the President of the United States in an effort to stop the counting of electoral votes, which is a constitutional process. And so I do think the attacks are very different. I think there is a grave threat, certainly, to our system, to our constitutional institutions. And I think we have to set partisanship aside and party politics aside to get to the bottom of what happened and make sure that it doesn't happen again.
Well, what do you say to Republicans who listen to that? And obviously you addressed the 9/11 comparison, the Pearl Harbor comparison, but they also listen to a pitch for voting rights bills. H.R. 1 and H.R. 4 are both bills you voted against.
That's right.
Yet Democrats are using and linking those to make a sales pitch, essentially, for passing those pieces of legislation based on the work of your committee and this day.
Well, I have strong policy disagreements with both H.R. 1 and H.R. 4. As you noted, I voted against those. I think the committee has important legislative work to do, though. We need to look at things like, are there reforms necessary to the Electoral Count Act? We need to look at things like, are there enhanced penalties that are necessary for a president who fails to come to the aid of Congress, who fails to come to the aid of any co-equal branch of government? We need to look at things like the dereliction of duty. When President Trump, we know he sat in the dining room next to the Oval Office while the attack was underway. He could have at any moment taken a few steps down the hall to the briefing room, gone on live television and urged his supporters to stop and go home, and he didn't do that. And so there are real legislative questions the committee needs to answer and needs to think about, but that doesn't mean that we're going to have complete agreement, or that I certainly agree with policy matters that I have not agreed with in the past.
When you hear Trump supporters point to that speech that he made on the Mall saying supporters should peacefully and patriotically march to the Capitol, what do you say?
Look, I think that you have to look at the speech. You have to look at the extent to which he was urging people to fight like hell. You have to look at the extent to which he had been for months, weeks before that, telling people, come to Washington, it'll be wild. I also think that you have to look at what he has said since. He continues to suggest that the violence on January 6th was justified. When he says November 3rd was the insurrection and January 6th was a protest, what he's doing is continuing to undermine our electoral process. He's gone to war with the rule of law, and I think that's also really important for people to understand. We had over 60 state and federal courts that heard his claims. Many of them were Trump judges. They heard the evidence in many of those cases, and they rejected them. And the President of the United States has got a fundamental constitutional responsibility to ensure that the laws are faithfully executed, and that is what Donald Trump failed to do.
What's the ultimate goal of the January 6th committee?
We have several goals. One is obviously the legislative purpose that I've mentioned, the extent to which there may be legislation or enhanced penalties, for example, that we need to look at to make sure this never happens again. We also need to ensure the American people know the truth, that the American people understand minute by minute. We know, for example, that President Trump attempted to pressure the people in his Justice Department. He said he was going to name Jeffrey Clark to be Attorney General, that he intended to do that. Jeffrey Clark has now told the committee he wants to take the fifth, and the entire leadership of his Justice Department threatened to resign. We know his White House counsel also threatened to resign. We know President Trump pressured local government officials to try to overturn the election. All of those things are a fundamental threat to our democracy and things that have got to be investigated. The American people need to have the truth about what happened.
But it sounds like, Congresswoman, that the goal of the committee perhaps is to go after Trump's inner circle and prevent the former president from running for president again. Is that a fair assessment of the goal?
No, the goal of the committee is what I said. We are a committee of Congress. Our responsibility is legislative purpose to determine what laws we have in place, what additional laws we might need to prevent an attack like that from ever happening again. And we need to understand what happened. We need to know what members of this body were doing, what they were engaged in. One of my colleagues, Scott Perry, for example, was very active in attempting to have Jeffrey Clark appointed as Attorney General. We need to understand what happened. The peaceful transfer of power is fundamental to the survival of our republic, and we all have a duty to ensure that peaceful transfer of power every 4 years.
What about the security failure here? The Capitol Police, the architect of the Capitol, the Senate Sergeant of Arms have all turned over requested documents to the House Administrations Committee overlooking the security aspect. The House Sergeant of Arms has not. Speaker Pelosi has said that the House Sergeant of Arms requested the National Guard, passed a note. There are open questions about the Speaker's involvement in interactions with the Sergeant of Arms during that time. And yet Chairman Thompson has announced on your committee that the Speaker's office is off limits and that there's no call for those documents for the House Sergeant of Arms. Why is that if it's designed to prevent something like this from not happening again?
Well, look, the committee itself is very focused on that issue. We have an entire investigative team focused on the security failures of that day, focused on the response of that day. We've got investigators who are looking at exactly the kinds of things that you've mentioned. So that is a really important set of issues. No office is off limits. No issue is off limits. We certainly need to get to the bottom of that. But it's important, Bret, to remember that if you say that the security lapses at the Capitol are to blame for the assault on the Capitol by a mob provoked by President Trump, that's the same thing as saying that the small business owners whose businesses were burned to the ground last summer by Antifa and BLM rioters, that the small business owners are responsible for that. And that's wrong. So security lapses are absolutely something that this committee is looking at and focused on, and it's one piece of a much larger issue that includes the former president's efforts to overturn the results of the election.
So you would push for the House Sergeant of Arms to cooperate and hand over documents, and the Speaker's office to cooperate as well, despite Chairman Thompson's comments?
Well, they certainly are, and I think that what you're describing as Chairman Thompson's comments are not accurate. It's not an accurate description of what the chairman has said, and he leads the committee, and as I said, we've got 5 investigative teams on the committee, and one of those 5 teams is focused precisely on this. All of our teams are staffed with non-political, professional prosecutors and investigators, and those security issues are going to be a focus of one part of this investigation.
What do you say to somebody sitting at home who may say, listen, I think that day was horrible. What happened that day was horrible, but I'm worried about getting my kids to school. I'm worried about what's happening with COVID. I'm worried about the next economic blip that I may face. And they look at the focus on 1/6 and say, why is this so important that that everything else gets pushed off to the side? What do you say to them?
That I absolutely share those concerns. I voted with President Trump 93% of the time, more than most Republican members of the House of Representatives. I'm a conservative Republican. I believe that the policies of the Biden administration are bad for this country. But I also know that this country must go forward on a basis of truth. We've got to be faithful to the Constitution and the rule of law. And that if we aren't faithful to those things, and if we don't tell the truth about history, then the institutions themselves begin to unravel. So if we want to be in a position where we can advocate conservative policies again, we've got to tell the truth about January 6th, and we have to make sure that it never happens again.
So why did the Wyoming Republican Party pass this resolution to no longer recognize you as a Republican and put out this long, lengthy statement about how you're closer to Nancy Pelosi, and they have a problem with that? Why?
Well, I would note the vote was 31-29, so it was a close-run thing, and certainly there are people in the state party apparatus of my home state who are quite radical, and some of those same people include people who were here on January 6th, include a party chair who has toyed with the idea of secession. So there is a very radical element of the Republican Party in the same way that there's a radical element of the Democratic Party. But we have to be in a position where we are able to come together, where we're able to focus on substance, on policy, and I look forward very much to putting my record of delivering for the people of Wyoming and fidelity to the Constitution up for the people of Wyoming to make a decision about this election cycle.
Last thing quickly, and this is kind of process, but you're the co-chair of the January 6th committee. Speaker Pelosi put you in that position. Who's the ranking member of the committee?
Well, I'm not the co-chair. Chairman Thompson is the chairman.
Vice chair.
Yes, I'm the vice chair, and I am the ranking Republican by nature of when I was appointed. The committee, I know that some on the Republican side who are attempting to obstruct the work of the committee include my colleague Jim Banks, for example, who's been sending letters to federal agencies claiming that he is the ranking member of the committee, which he's not. This committee is a bipartisan committee. It was constituted completely in accordance with the rules of the House and with the rules of the resolution that created it. And Minority Leader McCarthy refused to name people. He pulled back all of the people that he'd appointed to the committee. We're working in a nonpartisan fashion, and we're going to get our work done despite attempts to try to block and obstruct.
And will you push for the release of the hundreds or thousands of hours of videotape that has not come out?
Yes, I think it's really important for the American people to have a full picture. There are a lot of conspiracy theories that people are pushing that are dangerous and that are wrong, and I think people need to have a full picture of what happened on January 6th here at the Capitol, at the White House, and also in the weeks leading up to it.
Congresswoman Cheney, we appreciate you coming on. We want to hear
Thanks,
from all
Bret.
sides. Thanks.
I appreciate it. Thank you.